Hi everyone! Today I'm interrupting my series on the compatibility between different MBTI types to talk about a different idea that kind of came to my mind, and I thought it might be interesting to explore with you. And that is the perceived warmth that the different types can kind of express. And a disclaimer, I'm not going to claim that this is a way to kind of describe how warm these types really are on the inside. I'm just wanting to describe some external vibes that different types give off and how other people might interpret that as being warm or not so warm. And I'm going to group the types based on different categories. Okay, so all about that in the next few minutes. If you haven't already, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and let's dive in. Okay, so I was thinking a lot about this topic of warmth, and particularly perceived warmth, because that's not always the same as internal warmth, because I feel that in a lot of relationships, personal or professional, people have conflicts because of this, and people have difficulty relating with each other because of this. They get mad at each other, they misunderstand each other, they misinterpret what the other person actually wanted to say or do, and sometimes misread the other people, especially if they have quite a different personality type from theirs. And I was thinking to group the types into 4 categories, using the 2 letters in the middle. So the NFs, the NTs, the SFs, and the STs. If I look at it from a spectrum of the warmth that these types exude, I would do it as follow. SF would be on one extreme and NT would be on the other extreme. SF, in my opinion, is the cluster that tends, on average, to exude the most perceived warmth. And NT, I think, as a cluster, again, on average, not for everybody all the time, but on average, I think it's the grouping that tends to exude the least perceived warmth. And then in the middle, we have NF as a second warmth type, and ST as a third warmth type. So SF, NF, ST, and NT. Why? I believe that this has a lot to do with the cognitive functions that are at play. So if we look at the NTs, in David Kersey's terms, they are the intellectuals or the rationals, so INTJs, ENTJs, INTPs, and ENTPs. Probably from this group, ENTPs are the ones that exude the most warmth because of their higher or more expressive child extroverted feeling. However, in general, I believe that NTs tend to come across, especially when you don't know them so well, as quite cold, quite reserved, not particularly interested in showing a lot of warmth. And this is because their temperament prioritizes analysis. It prioritizes things that make sense, and it also pushes them a little bit into the abstract world. So their intuition makes them big picture focused. Sometimes it makes them kind of get lost in their head, in the world of possibilities and ideas and concepts. And then the thinking function, whether it's TI or TE, makes them quite interested in understanding things from a logical perspective and finding solutions that make sense. They are a utilitarian temperament as well, meaning that they care quite a lot about doing things in a way that kind of works, making sense of things that creates functionality, creates progress, creates growth. And sometimes because of this focus that they have and a certain way of communicating, other people might perceive them as emotionally detached or cold or aloof. Again, if we make a correlation with Enneagram, for example, a lot of NTs can have a pretty strong Enneagram 5 component, or they might even be core Enneagram 5s. And this means that they might sometimes even self-sabotage through a hyper-rationality, which means they're consistently trying to detach from feelings and make sure that they understand things, that they have a grasp of things rationally. But this does not necessarily mean that on the inside they don't feel feelings, or they are not warm, or they are not particularly interested in relationships. And I think a lot of them actually suffer because other people misinterpret what they say and do. Not in all cases, but there's plenty of situations where, especially in the workplace or in romantic relationships in early stages, they are perceived by feeling types, for example, to be too cold, too detached, not interested in their feelings, not interested in their relationship. And sometimes that is actually not true at all, but this is how they come across, okay? Now, moving on to ST types. I think if we compare them to NTs, they tend to give off a little bit more warmth. I think the sensing function, especially SI, but SE2 to a certain extent, kind of helps people to connect a little bit more to the reality, and because of that immerses them a little bit more into the present moment. So if they have a conversation with someone, they tend to give off a little bit more presence and a little bit more groundedness. And I feel like that's why I'm saying, especially with SI, so ISTJ, ESTJ, people can kind of feel this container of groundedness, of being kind of down to earth. And that sometimes is associated with a little bit more warmth than the intuition function, which is a bit more detached. Or sometimes head in the clouds, and people don't quite make sense of that, the way that maybe it is felt on the inside. It's something quite interesting because I've worked in organizations where ESTJs and ENTJs were usually in positions of middle or top management. And for me, working closely with TE has never been easy. It's always been a little bit challenging. But I've noticed different things. I've noticed that the ENTJs that I've worked with, who are my leaders, were people that I connected to more on a mental, intellectual side, but on an emotional side, there was a lot of this warm container that I was not perceiving. And then with an ESTJ, I would often feel like maybe we had less commonality in terms of how we thought about things, but they brought a little bit more warmth, which I think is really interesting because most people don't necessarily associate ESTJs or ISTJs with warmth. Stereotypically, they are quite far away from that in the way that they are described. But I'm trying to get to that. And so if we add ESTP and ISTP to this group, the STs, again, they don't prefer SI, they prefer SC, but that presence, that groundedness tends to come across as a little bit warmer. Again, if I were to pick an odd one out in this group, I would take ISTP and say, because generally, I've mentioned in some of my previous videos, ISTPs are the SP type from the artisan temperament that tends to move the closest to the NT group, and they often relate a lot to the NT temperament descriptions. Sometimes they are also quite aloof and distant, a bit more than the other SPs. And maybe ESTPs and the SJ types, again, give a bit more warmth. For ESTP because of FE, for ISTJ and ESTJ because of SI. Okay, next we have NFs. Now here we're getting into a more stereotypical space where generally people do tend to see more warmth in feeling types compared to thinking types, and particularly in FE types over FI types. But the reason why I put SF and NF rather than FP and FJ is again because of the sensing. I think it's really interesting. In the NF group, generally the four types tend to be perceived as quite warm in a lot of situations. INFJ and ENFJ because of their FE. And then INFPs and ENFPs often can exhibit certain surface level stereotypically FE behaviors or ways of communicating, because sometimes putting together NE and FI and these two functions working quite well with each other, they can create the impression that the person is expressing through FE, even though that might not be the case. But again, the stronger feeling function in them, their temperaments focus on people, discovering potential in others, encouraging people, often comes across as really warm and supportive, which is why a lot of people do perceive them to be this way. Although sometimes, kind of as an opposite to NTs, NFs might come across as really warm and people might feel like, oh, these people are here to listen to me forever. But on the inside, NFs might really struggle with that and might sometimes even feel overwhelmed, especially the introverted ones, because they do want to engage in the feeling function and connect with others and prioritize relationships and values and feelings and harmony. But on the inside, they might feel a little bit overwhelmed and exhausted and might struggle to actually set the boundaries that they need to set into place. Okay, and then SFs. I feel that in general, SFs tend to come across as the warmest types. There are some exceptions to this rule, but generally speaking, especially ISFJs and ESFJs tend to kind of exude a lot of warmth. ISFPs and ESFPs maybe a little bit less, but they also have this great talent in kind of bringing this warm energy. So ISFJs, ESFJs bring a more stereotypical warm container because of FE and SI, two functions that in my opinion come across as the warmest. So when they are together, they tend to create the space for others to feel really comfortable in, to feel listened to feel, cared for and so on. But then SE and FI together also can create something similar to what NE and FI do and appear as if they are acting as an FE function, or they can create this impression of energetic warmth where these people, due to their SE, might be more on the go, they might be more exploratory, more improvisational, more likely to want to try out new experiences, but their feeling function still prioritizes a lot of that relational and inner life world, particularly on the feeling dimension. And this mix of energy and people focus also can really make them seem warm. From this group, I would say that maybe the type that is perceived as the least warm could actually be ESFP because of their higher TE. And sometimes certain ESFPs who use a lot of SE and TE and maybe are a bit disconnected from their FI often are perceived as ESTJs or ENTJs. So that might be something to take into account. Okay, so these were my thoughts on the perceived warmth of different MBTI types and how this can come across to others, how it can influence relationships. And basically the message that I'm wanting to send across is that what you see in someone on the outside, especially when you don't know them so well, might be not fully indicative of their inner world. Maybe you perceive someone as cold, but in reality, maybe they are extremely warm on the inside. You might just need to wait for the ice to melt a little bit or know how to communicate and connect with them to get to that place. Or maybe conversely, if someone seems like they're always emotionally available to listen, to be with you, to show warmth, perhaps you might also think that if they do it too much, it could also be taxing to them and they might struggle to set boundaries. Of course, it's their responsibility to do it, but it might be an angle that could be interesting to look at. Okay, so thank you very much for being with me. I just wanted to remind you guys that I am a professional coach with a background in psychology and psychotherapy, and I'm certified by the International Coaching Federation. And in my work, I support people in enhancing their level of self-awareness and creating a life on their own terms. So if that sounds interesting to you, check out the link in the description below. It will take you to my website and you can find out more.